Behind the iron gates of her Newport mansion, Doris Duke paced the same corridors her father had walked decades earlier. Outside, tourists pointed cameras at the stone walls. Inside, an 80-year-old billionaire locked doors no one was trying to open. She owned 5 palaces scattered across America. Duke Farms in New Jersey, 2,700 acres of gardens and fountains. Shangri-La in Hawaii, 14,000 square feet of Islamic art, overlooking the Pacific. Rough Point in Rhode Island, 39,000 square feet of English Manor overlooking the Atlantic. A Beverly Hills estate once owned by Rudolph Valentino. 2 Manhattan apartments, a private Boeing 737 with a bedroom decorated to look like a real house. She employed 200 people to manage properties she barely visited anymore. By the early 1990s, the woman the press had once called the richest girl in the world moved between these fortresses like a fugitive, never staying anywhere long enough for the loneliness to settle. Her father had whispered 4 words to her as he died in 1925. Trust no one. She had spent 68 years following that advice. And on October 28, 1993, when Doris Duke died in her Beverly Hills home with a hearse already waiting in the driveway, only her butler stood witness. No family, no friends, just lawyers, doctors, and the man who would scatter her ashes into the Pacific Ocean 24 hours later. This is the story of how unimaginable wealth, a father's deathbed warning, and a lifetime of betrayals transformed a globe-trotting heiress into a recluse who built palaces she could never trust enough to enjoy. Before we dive into Doris Duke's extraordinary transformation, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below, and if you're fascinated by stories of America's gilded families and the secrets hidden behind their mansion gates, subscribe so you don't miss our next investigation into forgotten fortunes. Now, let's begin with the man who started it all. James Buchanan. Duke, called Buck by everyone who knew him, was born on December 23, 1856, on a farm near Durham, North Carolina, where his father grew tobacco alongside corn, wheat, and oats. When the Civil War ended, Union soldiers had destroyed most of the 300-acre Duke farm. The family was left with 50 cents, 2 blind mules, and whatever future they could scrape from dirt that had already given everything it had. Washington Duke, Buck's father, returned from Confederate service to find almost nothing intact. Almost. Hidden somewhere on the property, overlooked by the Union troops, sat a small load of tobacco. That tobacco sold so quickly that Washington Duke realized something important. People wanted this product badly enough to pay for it, even when they had almost nothing else. By 1872, the Duke family was selling 125,000 pounds of tobacco annually in a region still recovering from war. Where other families struggled to feed themselves, the Dukes were building something that resembled prosperity. Buck Duke learned the business from the ground up. He understood farming, curing, packaging, and most importantly, selling. At age 28, he opened a branch of the family factory in New York City. Within 5 years, W. Duke, Sons and Company was furnishing half the country's total production of cigarettes. The transformation came in 1885 when Buck Duke acquired a license to use the first automated cigarette-making machine, invented by James Albert Bonsack. Before automation, cigarettes were rolled by hand, slowly, expensively. The Bonsack machine changed everything. It could produce cigarettes faster than any human roller, cheaper than any competitor, and with a consistency that hand rolling could never match. Buck Duke bet the company's future on mechanization. He won. By 1890, the family company produced 45% of all cigarettes sold in America. But Duke wanted more than market share. He wanted control. After a brutal tobacco war among the 5 principal manufacturers, Duke emerged with a solution. In 1890, he convinced his competitors to merge into a single entity. The American Tobacco Company was born, controlling 90% of the United States cigarette market. Duke served as president. He was 34 years old and commanded an empire that would define American smoking habits for a generation. Duke pioneered marketing techniques that seem obvious now, but were revolutionary then. Tradable cigarette pictures tucked into packages, billboards plastered across cities. National advertising campaigns that made Duke brands household names. His competitors mocked what they called this damned picture business, claiming it degraded the industry. Smokers disagreed. They asked for Duke brands by name. The monopoly could not last. In 1906, the American Tobacco Company was found guilty of antitrust violations. 5 years later, the Supreme Court ordered the trust dissolved. The company was divided into 4 separate entities: American Tobacco Liggett and Myers, R.J. Reynolds, and P. Lorillard Company. Duke retained control only of the British American Tobacco Company, his international venture. For most men, losing a monopoly would mean losing everything. Duke simply pivoted. He had already begun investing in textiles and hydroelectric power. In 1904, he established the Catawba Power Company. The following year, he and his brother Benjamin founded the Southern Power Company, which would become Duke Power, the precursor to Duke Energy. Duke understood that lasting growth in the South required cheap, abundant electricity. He built dams, bought land, acquired water rights, and persuaded risk-averse mill owners to trust this new form of energy. By the 1920s, Duke's Southern Power Company was the leading electric utility in the Western Carolinas. His personal life was simpler than his business ventures, but not simple. After a brief first marriage that ended in divorce, Duke married Nanaline Holt Inman in 1907. She was a widow from Atlanta. They had one child together, a daughter named Doris, born November 22, 1912. Duke was 56 when his daughter arrived. He had built fortunes in tobacco and power. He had outlasted competitors and regulators. He had survived antitrust prosecution and emerged wealthier than before. But he had also learned something about the world that would shape his daughter's life in ways he could not have imagined. People wanted what he had. They lied to get it. They schemed. They betrayed. They smiled while planning to take everything. In December 1924, Duke established the Duke Endowment with $40 million. A portion would support Trinity College in North Carolina, which was renamed Duke University in honor of his father. The rest would fund hospitals, children's homes, rural Methodist churches, and retired pastors across the Carolinas. Duke believed in philanthropy, but he also believed in control. He famously told associates, "I am going to give a good part of what I make to the Lord, but I can make better interest for him by keeping it while I live." He managed his giving with the same precision he had brought to cigarette production. When James Buchanan Duke died in New York City on October 10th, 1925, he left approximately half of his roughly $100 million estate to the Duke Endowment. He left another $67 million to the endowment in his will. The remainder went to his wife Nanaline and his 12-year-old daughter Doris. Newspapers across the country ran the story. The richest little girl in the world. They called her the $1 million baby, a child who inherited more money than most adults would see in 10 lifetimes. But before the will was even read, before the estate was divided, before Doris Duke understood what wealth of that magnitude actually meant, her father pulled her close. He was dying. He knew it. And the last thing he told his only child was not, "I love you," or "take care of your mother." He said, "Trust no one. Trust no one." Those were the words James Buchanan Duke spoke to his daughter as he lay dying. Not encouragement, not comfort. Trust no one. Doris was 12 years old. She had spent her childhood at Duke Farms, the 2,700-acre New Jersey estate her father had transformed from farmland into a landscape containing 9 lakes, 35 fountains, 45 buildings, and more than 18 miles of roadway. She knew wealth. She knew gardens designed by Frederick Law Olmsted's firm. She knew conservatories and sculpture and stone walls that seemed to go on forever. What she did not know yet was that her father's final warning would become the operating principle of her entire life. The press christened her the richest little girl in the world the moment her father's will became public. At age 12, Doris Duke inherited $100 million, equivalent to roughly $1.5 billion in modern value. She would receive additional portions of the estate when she turned 21, 25, and 30. The fortune came from tobacco and hydroelectric power. It would generate income for the rest of her life, whether she worked or not, whether she spent wisely or foolishly, whether she trusted anyone or no one at all. But wealth did not mean freedom. Her mother, Nanaline, had received only a modest trust fund from her husband's estate. The bulk went to Doris. This created immediate resentment. Nanaline resented that her daughter controlled more money than she did. Doris resented her mother's attempts to control her life despite having less financial power. At age 14, Doris sued her mother to prevent her from selling family assets. The case went to court. Doris won. A teenage girl taking her own mother to court and winning sent a message that echoed through society circles. The Duke fortune belonged to Doris, and she would protect it from everyone, even family. When Doris expressed interest in attending college, Nanaline forbade it. Instead, her mother took her on a grand tour of Europe, where Doris was presented as a debutante in London society. The message was clear. Doris Duke was not being raised to think or work. She was being raised to be displayed, admired, and eventually married to someone her mother approved of. In 1930, Doris Duke had her formal debut at Rough Point, the Newport mansion her parents had purchased in 1922. 600 guests attended. The estate sat on the rocky coast overlooking the Atlantic, a massive English manor-style home designed by the architectural firm Peabody and Stearns for Frederick Vanderbilt decades earlier. The Dukes had hired architect Horace Trumbauer to renovate and expand it, adding a ballroom and formal entertaining spaces suitable for Newport's social season. Doris stood in those rooms wearing expensive gowns, smiling for cameras she did not want pointed at her, meeting people who saw dollar signs before they saw a person. She was 18 years old. She was 6 feet tall. She was worth a fortune that grew larger every year, and she was desperately lonely. The Great Depression fascinated Americans with a morbid curiosity about how the wealthy lived while others starved. Doris Duke and Barbara Hutton, the Woolworth heiress, were nicknamed the Gold Dust Twins because they were born just 10 days apart in 1912 and both inherited vast fortunes. The press loved comparing them. Hutton seemed to enjoy the attention. Duke loathed it. She avoided cameras, refused interviews, and developed a lifelong hatred of publicity that would eventually evolve into full paranoia. Her father had told her to trust no one. Every photographer, every reporter, every society columnist proved him right. They did not want to know her. They wanted to consume her story, sell it, profit from her existence. By the time Doris Duke turned 23, she had learned 3 things. Money attracted people who wanted to use her. Her mother resented her inheritance, and the only way to escape the suffocating control of her family was to marry someone, anyone, who could take her away from it all. She chose poorly. In 1935, at age 23, Doris Duke married James H.R. Cromwell, a 39-year-old socialite who had already been married to one heiress and seemed eager to acquire another. Cromwell was the stepson of wealthy financier Edward Stotesbury, but his previous marriage to Delphine Dodge, heiress to the automobile fortune, had ended. Now he had set his sights on Doris. The marriage shocked everyone who knew them. It was hasty, impulsive, and driven more by Doris's desire to escape than by any genuine connection between the two. Cromwell saw opportunity. Doris saw freedom. Neither was right. The couple embarked on a 2-year honeymoon that took them around the world. They traveled through Europe, Egypt, India, Indonesia, China, and finally Hawaii. In India, they met Mahatma Gandhi. Doris was captivated by the Taj Mahal and commissioned architects to design a marble bedroom suite inspired by what she had seen. The trip awakened something in her. She had spent her life locked inside estates designed by her father. Now she was seeing how other cultures built, decorated, and lived. She began collecting Islamic and Southeast Asian art with the same intensity her father had brought to acquiring tobacco companies. The honeymoon was supposed to last a few weeks in Hawaii. They stayed 4 months. Doris fell in love with the islands, the privacy, the distance from New York society. The sense that she could finally breathe without cameras or gossip or her mother's disapproval weighing on every decision. In 1936, she purchased 5 acres of land near Diamond Head on the island of Oahu. Construction began immediately on what would become Shangri-La, named after the mythical paradise in James Hilton's novel Lost Horizon. This would be the only home Doris Duke ever built entirely herself. 14,000 square feet designed to showcase the Islamic art she was beginning to acquire. A harbor dynamited into the rock to protect her yacht fleet. A 75-foot saltwater swimming pool carved from stone. Gardens and terraces surrounding a white main building that looked nothing like the heavy estates her father had favored. Shangri-La was hers. Every decision, every tile, every archway. While Shangri-La was being constructed, Cromwell's political ambitions became clear. He wanted Doris's money to fund a career in government. In 1940, he served briefly as United States ambassador to Canada, then resigned to run for the Senate. Doris funded his campaign. The media focused on the wealthy heiress more than her husband's qualifications. Cromwell lost to the incumbent, New Jersey Senator William Barber. The marriage, already strained, began to collapse under the weight of incompatible goals and Cromwell's obvious opportunism. That same year, on July 11, 1940, Doris gave birth to a daughter in Honolulu. She named the baby Arden. The child was born prematurely. She lived 24 hours. When Arden died, Doris was told by doctors that she would never be able to have children again. The devastation was total. Doris had lost the one thing money could not replace. She consulted psychics trying to reach her daughter. She became obsessed with the idea that Arden was still somehow accessible, still somehow waiting. This obsession with the daughter who lived only one day would shape the rest of Doris Duke's life in ways no one could have predicted. The marriage to Cromwell ended in 1943 after 5 years of contentious legal proceedings. Cromwell demanded $7 million in the divorce settlement. They battled in court for years. The final amount was never publicly disclosed, but Doris paid dearly to be free of him. Living separately now, Doris's behavior scandalized society. She had indiscreet affairs with multiple men. Speculation swirled about who might have been Arden's father. Doris never said. The one person she might have trusted with that information was buried in a Honolulu cemetery, having lived less than a day. The divorce was finalized in 1943, but Doris Duke never stopped consulting psychics, never stopped believing she might somehow reach her daughter. That obsession with the child who lived only one day would shape the rest of her life in ways no one could have predicted. For now, though she threw herself into the only things that seemed reliable: travel, art, and an endless series of affairs with men who either wanted her money or could never keep her interest long enough to matter. While Doris Duke could not control love, death, or other people's intentions, she could control her homes. And between the late 1930s and early 1960s, she transformed that control into an obsession, building and refining 5 separate estates scattered across America like pieces on a board game only she understood how to play. Duke Farms remained her official domicile and primary residence. 2,700 acres in Hillsborough Township, New Jersey, the estate her father had developed from farmland into a landscape paradise. Doris added her own contribution. Duke Gardens, a 60,000 square foot public indoor botanical display that opened in 1964. It became one of the largest in America, featuring plants from around the world arranged in themed greenhouse environments. Visitors could walk through tropical jungles, arid deserts, Mediterranean landscapes, all within a property that remained fundamentally private. The gardens were open. The house was not. Rough Point, the Newport mansion she inherited from her father, became her favorite residence. 39,000 square feet on 10.8 acres overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. The original structure had been built between 1887 and 1892 for Frederick and Louise Vanderbilt by the Boston architectural firm Peabody and Stearns. The grounds were designed by Frederick Law Olmsted's landscape firm. When James Duke purchased the property in 1922, he hired Horace Trumbauer to renovate and expand it, adding a ballroom and formal entertaining spaces. After James Duke's death, Nanaline and Doris continued using it as a summer residence. Following Hurricane Carol in 1954 and the start of World War II, visits became less frequent. In the early 1950s, Nanaline took up permanent residence in New York and emptied Rough Point of all its furnishings. After Nanaline died in 1962, Doris inherited an additional $250 million from her mother's estate. Now in her late 40s, controlling a fortune that generated $1 million a week in interest, Doris returned to Rough Point. She spent 1958 and 59 purchasing art and antiques to refurnish the mansion, combining new acquisitions with family treasures. The house reopened in 1962. Doris lived there May through November most years. She filled it with paintings by Renoir, Gainsborough, Reynolds, and Van Dyck. Ming Dynasty porcelain vases worth millions. 16th century Flemish tapestries, some from the Palace of Versailles. Louis XVI chairs that had been sat on by Louis himself. And in her bedroom, purple curtains from J.C. Penney hanging beside a Renoir on the wall. The juxtaposition was pure Doris Duke, priceless art next to budget department store fabric. She saw no contradiction. Shangri-La, completed in 1938, remained her Hawaiian retreat. 14,000 square feet on 5 acres overlooking the Pacific and Diamond Head. The only home she built herself. She filled it with more than 3,500 objects of Islamic art, spanning the 7th through 19th centuries. Ceramics, textiles, paintings, tile panels, full-scale architectural elements. She commissioned work specifically for the space and acquired originals during her extensive travels through North Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia. The collection was not locked away. Doris displayed it, lived with it, rearranged it constantly. She had a harbor carved into the rock below the estate to protect her yacht fleet, including Kailani Lahilahi, a 58-foot motor yacht, and Kimo, a 26-foot mahogany runabout she used to commute into Honolulu. She was hands-on with everything. Staff watched her climb 3-story scaffolding to clean tile murals in the courtyard. She worked alongside her gardeners, directing every planting decision. In Beverly Hills, she purchased Falcon's Lair in 1952 from the estate of silent film star Rudolph Valentino. In Manhattan, she maintained 2 apartments, a 9-room penthouse with a 1,000-square-foot veranda at 475 Park Avenue, later owned by journalist Cindy Adams. Another apartment near Times Square that she used exclusively as an office for managing her financial affairs. She owned a Boeing 737 and redecorated the interior to include a bedroom designed to resemble a bedroom in a real house, because even at 30,000 feet, Doris Duke wanted to feel grounded in something familiar. Managing this empire required a staff of more than 200 people. Doormen, elevator operators, housekeepers, cleaners, maintenance workers, cooks, electricians, plumbers, carpenters, tailors, seamstresses, security guards, groundskeepers, and personal assistants moved through her properties like a small army. They shipped vegetables and flowers from Duke Farms greenhouses to Rough Point each spring to be planted in Newport. They maintained detailed logs of every activity on the estates. They kept receipts for every purchase and inventories of what occupied each room in each house. The logistics were staggering, yet Doris remained intimately involved, approving design decisions, inspecting work, surprising contractors by noticing when walls were 2 degrees out of plumb. By her 50th birthday, Doris Duke owned more homes than most people visit in a lifetime, employed more staff than many small companies, and commanded a fortune that generated $1 million a week in interest alone. But inside those massive estates, she lived mostly alone, moving from property to property like a fugitive, never staying anywhere long enough for the loneliness to catch up with her. She needed people around her, but trusted none of them. Which is why when she met a man who claimed to love danger as much as she did, she married him within a year. Porfirio Rubirosa was everything James Cromwell was not. Where Cromwell had been calculating and political, Rubirosa was reckless and sensual. Where Cromwell wanted Doris's money to fund a Senate campaign, Rubirosa wanted it to fund polo ponies, sports cars, and B-25 bombers converted into personal yachts. Doris, working briefly for Harper's Bazaar in Paris after World War II, met him and was instantly captivated. She had spent the war years more productively than most heiresses. In 1945, she worked as a foreign correspondent for the International News Service, reporting from war-torn European cities. After the war, she continued writing for Harper's Bazaar. It was in Paris that she encountered Rubirosa, a Dominican diplomat whose legendary reputation preceded him. He had been married to the daughter of Dominican dictator Rafael Trujillo. His second wife was French actress Danielle Derieux. When Doris decided she wanted him, She paid Dario $1 million to agree to an uncontested divorce. The U.S. State Department actually warned Doris about the political implications of using her wealth this way. They cautioned her against promoting political agendas or giving a foreign government too much leverage should something happen to her. Doris ignored them. On September 1st, 1947, Doris Duke became the third wife of Porfirio Rubirosa. His reputation was so outsized that Parisian waiters jokingly referred to tall pepper mills as rubies. "Pass me the ruby," they would say, and everyone knew what they meant. The marriage was rocky from the start. Rubirosa was a playboy in the truest sense. He had no interest in fidelity or domesticity. Doris, still mourning the daughter she lost, still consulting psychics, still searching for something to fill the emptiness, thought perhaps danger and passion might substitute for trust. They did not. The marriage lasted 13 months. When it ended, Doris tried to kill herself by slitting her wrists. She survived. The divorce settlement was spectacular. Rubirosa received a 17th-century house in Paris on Rue de Bellechasse, a fishing fleet off the coast of Africa, several sports cars, a converted B-25 bomber that he named Laganza, a stable of polo ponies, and $25,000 per year in alimony until he remarried. Friends later said Doris never got over him. In 1954, while in Geneva, she read an international newspaper headline, "Ruby and Barbara Hutton wed." Her rival, the other Gold Dust twin, had married her ex-husband. The marriage lasted 53 days. Doris never remarried. Over the following decades, Doris Duke collected lovers the way she collected Islamic art. Beautiful, temporary, ultimately unable to fill the emptiness. Errol Flynn, the movie star. General George Patton. Duke Kahanamoku. The Hawaiian Olympic swimming champion who taught her competitive surfing. Alec Cunningham Reid, a British member of Parliament. Louis Bromfield, the conservationist and writer. Joe Castro, a jazz pianist. Dozens of others. She maintained relationships that suited her schedule, her mood, her need for companionship, without commitment. Trust no one. Her father's advice had proven correct again and again. Men wanted her money, her influence, her name, her properties. What they rarely wanted was her. After Rubirosa, Doris Duke stopped looking for lasting love. She collected lovers the way she collected Islamic art. Beautiful, temporary, ultimately unable to fill the emptiness. But if people kept disappointing her, she discovered that buildings did not. And in the late 1960s, she found a new purpose. If she could not save herself, perhaps she could save something else. She began by rescuing an entire city's architectural soul. By the late 1950s, Doris Duke had returned to Rough Point, the Newport mansion she inherited from her father. The house had been emptied and closed after Hurricane Carol in 1954, but something pulled her back. She began refurnishing room by room, combining family treasures with new acquisitions from her travels. And for the first time in years, she stayed in one place long enough to notice what was happening around her. Newport in the 1960s faced an identity crisis. The city's colonial-era buildings, some dating back to the early 1700s, were threatened by redevelopment. Developers wanted to tear down historic structures to make way for modern construction. These were not grand mansions like the Breakers or the Elms. These were simple, beautiful colonial homes that represented Newport's pre-Gilded Age history. They were being demolished at an alarming rate. Doris Duke, who had spent her life surrounded by architecture her father commissioned, architecture that announced wealth and power, suddenly became interested in architecture that represented something quieter. History, craft, community. In 1968, Doris Duke founded the Newport Restoration Foundation. She appointed Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, the former First Lady with whom she had developed a close friendship, as vice president. Together, they purchased and began restoring colonial buildings that were slated for destruction. Over the next several years, Duke personally funded the acquisition of more than 83 individual houses. She hired architects and tradespeople to restore them according to historically informed principles. She rented most of them as private residences, maintaining a full-time crew of carpenters and painters to keep them in good condition. The Newport Restoration Foundation became one of the largest preservation efforts undertaken in modern American history. Today, the foundation still owns 78 historic properties. 73 of which are rented to tenants. The work Duke began continues, now expanding to address climate change impacts on historic coastal structures. Duke threw herself into the restoration work with the same intensity she brought to everything else. According to documentary evidence and first-hand accounts from architects and tradesmen, she was hands-on. She regularly attended meetings to review drawings, she visited building sites to approve or make changes to the work in progress. She demanded quality, she demanded authenticity, and she was willing to pay for both. But while Doris Duke was saving buildings, she was also employing people, and one of those people was a 42-year-old gay man named Eduardo Tirella. Eduardo Tirella was a war hero. He had served his country, survived, and returned to build a career in interior design and art curation. He was talented, well-connected, and rising in his field. Friends with Sharon Tate, Richard Burton, and other Hollywood stars. After spending 7 years working for Doris Duke, curating art for her estates and designing interiors, Tirella was ready for his next chapter. He had secured work as a film set designer in Hollywood. His career was taking off. All he had to do was tell Doris he was leaving. Friends warned him, "No one leaves Doris Duke. She does not take it well." Tirella knew this, but he believed in doing things properly. Professionally, he would tell her in person. Thank her for the opportunity. Explain that he was moving to California to pursue film work. It seemed like the respectful thing to do. On October 7, 1966, around 5 o'clock in the evening, Doris Duke and Eduardo Tirella were leaving Rough Point in a rented Dodge Polara station wagon. They planned to pick up an artifact from a local antiques dealer. Staff later reported that the two had been arguing earlier in the day. Tirella had told Duke about Hollywood. She was furious. Tirella was driving. When they reached the massive wrought iron gates at the entrance to the estate, he got out of the car to open them manually. Duke slid over to the driver's seat. What happened next depends on who you ask. According to the official police account, Duke accidentally accelerated. The car lurched forward, struck Tirella, pushed him through the gates, and dragged him across Bellevue Avenue. He was crushed against a tree on the opposite side of the street. He died instantly from brain hemorrhage, skull fractures, rib fractures, and multiple internal injuries. Duke told police that the car suddenly leaped forward and she was on top of him. She could not explain how it happened. She seemed dazed. Two civilians, Louis Tom and his daughter Judith, found Duke wandering the road shortly after the crash. Judith later recalled that Duke blurted out that she had run someone over. Someone named Ed. Then Duke ran back toward Rough Point. Newport Police Chief Joseph A. Radice conducted a brief investigation. 96 hours after Eduardo Tirella's death, Radice ruled it an unfortunate accident. "There's no cause to prefer charges against Miss Duke," he announced. The case was closed. Doris Duke walked free. 1 week after Tirella's death, Duke donated $25,000 to restore Newport's cliff walk. She gave another $10,000 to Newport Hospital. Some saw these as generous contributions from a grieving employer. Others called them blood money, payments to ensure the city's silence and cooperation. In 1971, Eduardo Tirella's family sued Doris Duke for wrongful death, demanding $1.25 million. The civil trial found Duke negligent. The court ordered her to pay the family $5,620. For context, Doris Duke was earning $1 million per week in interest on her fortune at that time. She paid less for Eduardo Tirella's life than she spent on Persian rugs. Eduardo's niece later said she killed him twice, once when she ran him over, and again when she paid almost nothing for his death. Decades later, investigative journalist Peter Lance would examine the case and conclude that the evidence suggested murder, not accident. Lance claimed that a fabricated police interrogation transcript was created to close the case quickly. He argued that forensic evidence showed Duke committed multiple intentional acts leading directly to Tirella's death. The Newport Police Department briefly reopened the investigation in 2021 after a witness came forward, but ultimately concluded there was no new evidence to change the original ruling. Eduardo Tirella's death remains officially classified as an accident. The official record called Eduardo Tirella's death an unfortunate accident. The civil court called it negligence. Either way, Doris Duke paid less for a man's life than she spent on Persian rugs, and either way, she walked free. But something changed after that night on Bellevue Avenue. The woman who already trusted no one now had reason to believe the world was watching. judging, waiting for her to make another mistake. She retreated deeper into her estates, and for the next 2 decades she would search desperately for the one thing money could never buy: someone who would never leave her. In early 1984, Doris Duke was 73 years old and living primarily at Shangri-La, her Hawaiian estate overlooking the Pacific. She had everything money could buy and nothing it could not. Then one day, someone told her about a woman living on a Hare Krishna commune who practiced Eastern philosophy, loved animals, and believed in reincarnation. Doris Duke, who had spent 44 years consulting psychics to reach her daughter Arden, agreed to meet her. Chandi Heffner, born Charlene Gale. Heffner in 1953 in Baltimore was living on a communal farm in Hawaii when she met Doris. She was 31 years old. Doris was 73. They shared interest in dance, Eastern philosophy, and animals. They talked about spirituality. They talked about Arden. And somewhere in those conversations, Doris became convinced that Chandi was the reincarnation of her dead daughter. The baby who lived 24 hours had somehow returned as a 31-year-old woman on a Hare Krishna farm. To anyone outside the relationship, this sounded like delusion. To Doris Duke, it sounded like salvation. By 1985, Chandi had become Doris's constant companion. Doris showered her with gifts: a $1 million home in Hawaii, designer clothes, jewelry, access to the estates, travel. Chandi also began taking an advisory role in Duke's finances, inserting herself into business decisions that had previously been handled by longtime advisors. In 1988, when Doris Duke was 75 years old, she legally adopted Chandi Heffner, who was then 35. The adult adoption shocked observers. Wealthy people sometimes adopted younger partners or companions for estate planning purposes, but this seemed different. Doris genuinely believed she was reclaiming her daughter. It was also Chandi who introduced Doris Duke to Bernard Lafferty. Lafferty was an Irishman who had been orphaned at 17 and emigrated to Philadelphia. He worked in hotels and theaters before becoming a personal assistant to singer Peggy Lee. He was gay, charming, and known for cross-dressing, which Doris found riotously funny. She would loan him her jewelry to wear, treating his performances as entertainment. Lafferty was also virtually illiterate and struggled with alcohol throughout his life. In 1987, Doris Duke hired him as her butler. Staff accounts from this period paint a complicated picture. According to Liz McConville, who served as Duke's secretary for 18 years, the day after the adoption, Chandi changed and became the little tyrant she really is. Servants complained that Chandi alienated everyone with bossy demands. Colin Shanley, Duke's cook, said he quit in 1989 because of Chandi's behavior. Others reported similar experiences. The woman who had seemed kind and spiritual before the adoption transformed into someone who treated staff as subordinates rather than people. She had bought and paid for Chandi 100%. McConville later said of Doris, and Doris could never stand divided loyalty. For a brief moment, it seemed like Doris Duke had finally found what she needed: a daughter she could raise on her own terms, a butler who made her laugh, a household that felt, if not quite like family, then at least like belonging. But Doris Duke had never learned how to share, and when Chandi's attention turned to someone else, the fragile arrangement shattered with the speed and violence of everything Doris touched when she felt betrayed. In 1989, Chandi Heffner became romantically involved with James Burns, one of Doris Duke's bodyguards. The secretary who had worked for Duke for 18 years later described what happened next with brutal clarity. Chandi's loyalty became divided, and Doris could never stand that. She had bought and paid for Chandi 100%. Staff watched the relationship deteriorate. Servants complained that Chandi alienated everyone, including Bernard Lafferty, with bossy demands. Some said the day after the adoption she changed completely. Others noted that she began acting entitled, treating Duke's staff as her own servants rather than showing any gratitude or humility. The cook quit. Others considered leaving. The household, which had briefly felt stable, became tense and uncomfortable. By February 1991, Duke's disenchantment with Chandi peaked. She ordered her lawyer to tell Chandi to get out, leave the properties, leave the life Doris had given her, end the relationship. They never saw each other again. Later that year, Duke formally disinherited Chandi from her will. The woman she had believed was her reincarnated daughter was erased as completely as if she had never existed. But the paranoia did not end with Chandi's departure. Duke became convinced that Chandi and Burns had been conspiring against her. She had food and sherry at Shangri-La tested for poison. No poison was found. The tests came back negative, yet Duke could not shake the belief that people were trying to harm her. In 1990, at age 78, Duke became mysteriously ill at her Hawaii home. Bernard Lafferty convinced her that Chandi and Burns were behind it. Whether he genuinely believed this or saw an opportunity to isolate Duke further is unclear. Either way, Lafferty persuaded Duke to leave Hawaii and move to Beverly Hills, specifically to Falcon's Lair, the estate she had purchased from Rudolph Valentino's estate in 1952. Once in Beverly Hills, Duke became clinically depressed. She turned the management of her life and affairs over to Bernard Lafferty entirely. The butler who had made her laugh, who dressed in her clothes and jewelry for fun, who had seemed harmless and entertaining, now controlled when she saw doctors who had access to her, what information reached her, and increasingly, what decisions were made in her name. Duke began changing her will repeatedly. Longtime advisors were fired, new executors were named, then removed, then replaced again. The only constant was Bernard Lafferty. By the end of 1991, Doris Duke had fired or alienated nearly everyone who had known her for more than a few years. Her adopted daughter was gone. Her longtime advisors were replaced. The only constant was Bernard Lafferty, the butler who made her laugh, who listened to her fears, who promised he would never leave her. She rewarded that loyalty by making him one of the most powerful people in her life. And then she started getting sick. April 1992. At age 79, Doris Duke decided she wanted a facelift. She asked her servants to find Dr. Harry Glassman, a well-known Hollywood plastic surgeon. What she did not know was that this single decision would begin a cascade of medical disasters that would end with her death just 18 months later. The facelift was performed. While Duke was still heavily medicated from the surgery, she tried to walk. She fell and broke her hip. This required additional surgery and a long recovery period. Duke, who had always been active, climbing scaffolding and working in gardens, was now limited in mobility and in pain. In January 1993, she underwent knee replacement surgery. She was hospitalized from February 2nd through April 15th. The recovery was difficult. Duke was 80 years old. Her body was not healing the way it once had. In April 1993, just 6 months before her death, Doris Duke made critical changes to her will. She removed Dr. Harry Demopoulos, her longtime friend and physician, as executor. In his place, she named Bernard Lafferty as the sole individual co-executor of her estate. She also named Lafferty to the board of the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. As executor, Lafferty would receive a $5 million fee plus $500,000 per year for life. For a man who had been working as a butler, this represented sudden, extraordinary wealth and power. On March 9, 1993, Duke signed a codicil to her will. She was so weak that her lawyer, William Doyle, had to guide her hand to complete the signature. Doyle later admitted he knew the will would be challenged. It was clear she was disinheriting her daughter, he said, referring to Chandi. Any third grader would realize this was going to be a contested estate, yet the will was executed. The paperwork was filed. Bernard Lafferty was now positioned to control a $1.3 billion fortune. The months that followed Duke's release from the hospital in April were hard. She was often forgetful and disoriented. She still had problems with her artificial knees. She made short trips to Hawaii and New Jersey before returning to Los Angeles. In July 1993, against the advice of both Dr. Kivowitz and Eleanor Lawson, her longtime friend and dance teacher, Duke insisted on having a second knee operation. 2 days after she went home from the hospital, she had a stroke and nearly died. For the remainder of the summer and into fall, Duke was in and out of hospitals, taking multiple painkillers, isolated from everyone except Bernard Lafferty. There was reportedly a choking incident at some point. Lafferty refused to call an ambulance. Friends, former advisors, and concerned parties tried to reach Duke. Lafferty controlled access. Phone calls were not returned. Visitors were turned away. On October 28, 1993, Doris Duke died at Falcon's Lair in Beverly Hills. She was 80 years old. The official cause of death was progressive pulmonary edema resulting in cardiac arrest. A hearse was already waiting in the driveway when she died. Bernard Lafferty had arranged for her body to be taken immediately for cremation, within 24 hours of her death. Doris Duke was cremated. There was no autopsy. No family members were present at her deathbed. No close friends. Only Bernard Lafferty, lawyers and doctors. Lafferty scattered her ashes into the Pacific Ocean, just as the will specified. Within hours of Doris Duke's cremation, the questions began. Why had a woman worth $1.3 billion been cremated so quickly when she had always feared fire? Why had her longtime physician been replaced as executor just months before her death? Why had a virtually illiterate butler with a drinking problem been given control of one of the world's largest fortunes? And most urgently, why had a nurse come forward claiming that Doris Duke had been drugged to death? The battle for her billions was about to begin. November 1st, 1993. Just 4 days after Doris Duke's death, Bernard Lafferty and U.S. Trust filed a petition for probate of her will. The document left virtually her entire fortune to charitable foundations dedicated to the arts, medical research, child welfare, and environmental conservation. Noble causes. But Lafferty himself stood to control $1.5 billion as executor, and he was already spending like a man who believed the money was his. The will named Lafferty as co-executor alongside U.S. Trust. Marion Oates Charles was named as trustee. This arrangement gave Lafferty enormous power over how Duke's fortune would be distributed to charities. It also gave him control over estate assets during the probate process. And according to later court documents, Lafferty immediately began using that access. He lived in Duke's estates. He used estate credit cards. He drove Duke's cars, including a Cadillac that he eventually destroyed. He spent lavishly on personal expenses. U.S. Trust, the corporate co-executor, did nothing to stop him. In fact, U.S. Trust gave Lafferty an $825,000 unsecured loan, creating what the surrogate court would later call a conflict of interest. In January 1995, multiple parties filed motions to remove Bernard Lafferty as executor. The allegations were sensational: kidnapping, murder, waste of estate assets, commingling of personal and estate funds, substance abuse, improvidence, and want of understanding based on his limited literacy and lavish spending habits. Tammy Payette, one of the nurses who had cared for Duke in her final months, filed an affidavit alleging that Duke had been drugged to death with morphine and Demerol. She claimed that Dr. Charles Kivowitz had conspired with Bernard Lafferty to hasten Duke's death. Miss Duke did not die of natural causes and was not in danger of dying until the large doses of morphine were given to her, Payette stated. The Los Angeles Police Department opened an investigation. Detectives interviewed witnesses. They reviewed medical records. They examined the circumstances of Duke's final days. No criminal charges were ever filed. The investigation concluded without indictments, but the civil proceedings in surrogate's court continued. Richard Q., a former prosecutor, was appointed to investigate the allegations against Lafferty. His report, based on interviews with more than 50 people, raised serious concerns. However, because the report did not contain sworn statements, and the identities of many witnesses were not disclosed, counsel for Lafferty objected on due process grounds. Lafferty and U.S. Trust submitted their own responses, including affidavits from Lafferty himself, 3 senior officers of U.S. Trust, and 30 estate employees, friends, physicians, and advisors of Doris Duke. These affidavits raised factual disputes about the information in Q's report. On May 22, 1995, surrogate Renee Roth made an order summarily removing both Bernard Lafferty and U.S. Trust as executors. The surrogate identified multiple grounds for removal. Lafferty had commingled estate and personal assets. He had wasted estate assets through unauthorized use and destruction of property. He demonstrated improvidence and want of understanding based on his lavish spending and limited literacy. He struggled with substance abuse. U.S. Trust had failed to rein in Lafferty's misconduct and had created conflicts of interest through the unsecured loan. The surrogate replaced Lafferty and U.S. Trust with Alexander D. Forger, an attorney, and Morgan Guaranty Trust Company as temporary co-executors. A divided appellate division later affirmed the removal, though the Court of Appeals would eventually find that the summary removal without a hearing was improper under the circumstances. Regardless, the damage to Lafferty's position was done. In 1996, new permanent trustees were appointed. Dr. Harry Demopoulos, the physician Duke had originally named as executor; J. Carter Brown, director of the National Gallery of Art; Marion Oates Charles, the only trustee from Duke's last will; James Gill, a lawyer; Nannerl O'Keohane, president of Duke University; and John J. Mack, president of Morgan Stanley. The legal battle consumed 3 years, and between $10 and $50 million in attorney fees, depending on which estimate you believe. During that time, not a penny went to charity. The foundations Duke had created to support the arts, medical research, child welfare, and environmental causes received nothing, while lawyers argued over who should control the money. Chandi Heffner also sued the estate. She claimed that Doris Duke had promised to provide for her for life, and that the disinheritance was unjust. Chandi argued that she had been manipulated out of the will by Bernard Lafferty and others with ulterior motives. The case drew significant media attention. After years of litigation, Chandi reached a settlement in 1995. She agreed to drop all claims against the estate in exchange for $65 million. As part of the agreement, Chandi was required to never discuss Duke's life publicly or write a book about their relationship. The settlement was approved by surrogate Renee Roth on December 28, 1995. Bernard Lafferty did not live to see the final resolution. On November 4th or 5th, 1996, he died at age 51. The cause was complications from alcohol and drug abuse. His weight had ballooned to more than 250 pounds. The legal battle had taken an enormous toll. His lawyer said Lafferty felt it was his duty to carry out Duke's wishes, but he was frustrated that 3 years later, not a penny had gone to charity while legal fees mounted. Lafferty had asked to be cremated and his ashes scattered off Hawaii, the same place where he had scattered Doris Duke's remains 3 years earlier. When the legal dust finally settled, Doris Duke's fortune went where she had intended, to charity, to the arts, to causes she believed in, but the people she had surrounded herself with in her final years were gone. Chandi Heffner took her millions and disappeared into quiet philanthropic work in Hawaii. Bernard Lafferty died alone, just as Duke had, destroyed by the same substances that had made him unreliable from the start. And the estates, those 5 palaces scattered across America, passed into new hands with a very different purpose. Doris Duke had specified in her will exactly what should happen to her properties. Duke Farms in New Jersey, Shangri-La in Hawaii, and Rough Point in Rhode Island were all to be open to the public for educational purposes. The woman who had locked herself away from the world wanted, in the end, to share what she had built with anyone who cared to look. Duke Farms opened to the public in 2012 as an environmental center. The 2,700-acre property is now operated by the Duke Farms Foundation, a subsidiary of the Doris Duke Foundation. Admission is free. The center leads in environmental stewardship and sustainability, demonstrating equitable climate solutions and engaging leaders through programs held on the campus. The original Duke Gardens greenhouses, which Doris opened to the public in 1964, are no longer standing, but a video tour preserves their memory. The grounds remain spectacular: 9 lakes, extensive gardens, walking trails, all accessible to anyone who wants to visit. Shangri-La became the Doris Duke Foundation for Islamic Art. Tours are available through a partnership with the Honolulu Museum of Art. Visitors can see the 14,000-square-foot home exactly as Duke designed it, filled with more than 3,500 objects of Islamic art spanning centuries. The collection includes ceramics, textiles, paintings, tile panels, and full-scale architectural elements from across the Islamic world. An artist residency program continues to this day, bringing contemporary artists to work in the space Duke created. The property operates as both a museum and a center for promoting the study and understanding of Islamic arts and cultures. Rough Point was deeded to the Newport Restoration Foundation in 1999 and opened to the public in 2000. The house is preserved exactly as Doris Duke left it in 1992. Visitors can tour the first floor, Then continue upstairs to see Duke's bedroom with its purple J.C. Penney curtains hanging beside a Renoir. The collections remain: paintings by Van Dyck, Gainsborough, Reynolds, Ming Dynasty porcelain vases worth millions, 16th century Flemish tapestries, Louis XVI chairs. The gardens designed by Frederick Law Olmsted's firm still offer panoramic views of the Atlantic Ocean. Tours are available Tuesday through Sunday, from May through November. Tickets cost $25, with children under 12 admitted free. Groups are limited to 12 to 14 people, creating an intimate experience that lets visitors genuinely see how Doris Duke lived. The Newport Restoration Foundation that Duke founded in 1968 continues her preservation work. The organization still owns 78 historic properties, 73 of which are rented as private residences and maintained by a full-time crew. The foundation has expanded its mission to address climate change impacts on historic coastal structures, conducting research and developing strategies to protect Newport's architectural heritage from rising sea levels and increased storm damage. The Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, established in 1996 after the legal battles concluded, manages assets of approximately $1.3 billion. The foundation supports 4 main areas: arts and culture, particularly the performing arts; nature, including environmental conservation, wildlife and ecology; medical research; and child well-being, including prevention of cruelty to children and animals. The foundation operates Duke Farms and Shangri directly and provides funding to support Rough Point. Grants are distributed annually to organizations across the United States working in these focus areas. The estates Doris Duke built as fortresses against a world she did not trust now welcome thousands of visitors each year. People walk through her bedroom at Rough Point, photograph the courtyard at Shangri-La, explore the gardens at Duke Farms. They see Ming vases and Persian tiles, Renaissance tapestries, and modernist architecture. What they cannot see, what no visitor will ever fully understand, is what it felt like to own all of this and trust none of it. To have 5 palaces and feel safe in none of them. To lock the gates and still feel exposed. Doris Duke spent 68 years following her father's final advice: trust no one. She married twice. Both marriages ended in divorce and financial settlements that proved men wanted her money more than they wanted her. She gave birth to one child who lived 24 hours. She consulted psychics for 44 years, trying to reach that daughter. She adopted a 35-year-old woman she believed was her baby reincarnated, then disinherited her when loyalty wavered. She built 5 estates across America and filled them with some of the world's finest art. She employed 200 people to maintain properties she could barely enjoy. She founded the Newport Restoration Foundation and saved 83 historic buildings from demolition, preserving an entire city's architectural heritage for future generations. She donated more than $400 million during her lifetime to causes ranging from AIDS research in the 1980s to environmental conservation to the performing arts. Yet her legacy is complicated by the shadows. Eduardo Tirella died under her car in 1966. Whether accident or murder, the civil court found her negligent, and she paid his family $5,620 for his life. Chandi Heffner was adopted, showered with gifts, then erased when she became involved with someone else. Bernard Lafferty, the butler who cross-dressed for her entertainment and made her laugh, ended up controlling her estate despite being virtually illiterate and struggling with substance abuse. He died 3 years after she did, destroyed by alcohol and drugs. The circumstances of Duke's own death remain controversial. A nurse claimed she was drugged with morphine. She was cremated within 24 hours without an autopsy. No criminal charges were ever filed. The questions linger. What Duke's life reveals is that wealth cannot buy trust, family, safety, or peace. Isolation perpetuates itself. The more you withdraw, the more dangerous the world becomes, because you lose the ability to distinguish between genuine threats and imagined ones. Duke's estates became metaphors for her psychological state, magnificent on the outside, empty inside. She collected everything: art, homes, lovers. But connection eluded her. The walls she built to keep danger out also kept connection out. Today, visitors to Duke Farms, Shangri-La, and Rough Point can experience the beauty Doris Duke created, but rarely enjoyed. They can walk through rooms she furnished with priceless treasures. They can see collections she spent decades assembling. They can stand in gardens she designed and overlook views she selected. The irony is profound. The woman who locked herself away from the world left behind spaces that now welcome it. The estates she used as fortresses have become bridges. Her father told her to trust no one, and she built 5 palaces to keep the world at bay. But in the end, the gates opened anyway. Doris Duke spent 68 years following her father's final advice. Trust no one. She built 5 palaces to keep the world at bay. She locked every gate, changed every will, tested the wine for poison. And in the end, she died exactly as he had warned her she would, alone, surrounded by people who saw her fortune more clearly than they saw her face. The estates remain. The art endures. The gardens grow, but the woman who owned them all trusted them to no one, not even herself.